Welcome to the Livid Lesbian Book Club. Listeners can find me on YouTube and Facebook, where I discuss Canadian news and politics that mainstream media is not covering. Being in the Cabinet, Speaking Truth to Power, is about Jody Wilson Raybould, Canada's first Indigenous Minister of Justice and Attorney General in the Cabinet of the newly elected Justin Trudeau. Go to the library, sign the book out, buy it. You don't even have to do it. Put your feet up, kick back, listen and relax. We'll do a chapter at a time. I have commentary through it. I can't help myself. Okay, here we go. Chapter 1, The Recruitment. Why did I write this book? Good question. Honestly, I'm not sure. No doubt I wanted to make sense of things I experienced while in federal government, including how I ended up resigning from cabinet and becoming an independent MP. That explains why this book is not a memoir of my entire life. I cannot imagine writing or someone reading such a thing. Another reason is that I felt and continue to feel I have a duty to share some reflections on the particular circumstances in which I found myself, of being the first Indigenous person to be the Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada. Fulfilling that role was not what I expected. Writing has helped me explore this reality, and perhaps it will be of interest to some of you. Oh yeah, Jody, us. Okay, back on track, guys. I think it may also provide a perspective on the moment in my life of Canada and some of the challenges that we face. Of course, no one's life unfolds in structured chapters. We all emerge from layers of peoples, places, cultures, and experiences. Histories shape our stories, so I can only speak of today and yesterday and tomorrow, as this book does, from a place that starts with the obvious but most important facts that have determined my life. I'm Indigenous and Canadian. I come from the Musqueam, I don't know how to say this. Okay, look that up, guys, where Jody's come from. Sorry, Jody. People of northern Vancouver Island who were a part of the Kawaka, also known as the Kawakal-speaking peoples. I was raised in a family of Indigenous leaders. My grandmother's name was Puglidi, the highest ranking name in our clan, the Eagle clan. Her name means a good host. My father's name is Kimes Kla, which means number one amongst the eagles, the chief who is always there to help. He is our clan's hereditary chief, and maybe I was just destined to carry on their work. My name, Puglis, means woman born to noble people. Our culture worldwide, spiritually, and the way of life are integrally related to the natural world around us, the land, air, and waters that have always sustained us. This is our religion. My society, in important ways, is a something one. Sorry, guys, sorry. I might have to take a sip of coffee. 1 sec. Okay, guys, you do you too, okay? Take a sip. Okay. This means that descent is traced and property is inherited through the female line. We are pot-latching peoples. The pot-latch is the core of how we govern ourselves. It is here that our names are passed down or given from generation to generation. It is where laws are made, disputes are settled, people are married, and wealth is redistributed. I was born on March 23rd, 1971 at Vancouver General Hospital. My mom is Sandy, whom I have lovingly called Old Boot. since she moved in a few doors down from me on our reserve at Cape Mug in 2007. Indigenous people tend to give nicknames to others, particularly those they love. Old Boot has reminded me over the years that I was not the prettiest baby. I was born jaundiced and with a purple birthmark in the middle of my forehead. Oh, I got one on my arm, Jody. Sorry about that. I was named Jody for no particular reason except that it was a popular name at the time. Puglis was given to me by my grandmother in her potlatch of Clifford Island when I was 5. I was given that name because of the roles and responsibilities, including around leadership, that I was expected to play and accept. As you will see, striving to embody my name is a big part of my story and the story told in this book. My dad, William Lane Wilson, Billy to my mom, and his mom, was not at my birth. As was common for him in those days, he was away for work. My parents were married in 1966 after being high school sweethearts in Courtenay, British Columbia. While they did not divorce until 1980, I have no memories of being at home with both mom and dad, as they separated not long after I was born. My sister Corey, who is 14 months older than me, also does not have memories of us living as a family. My family is in many ways typical of First Nations person growing up in Canada. I have an Indigenous father and my mom is of English and German descent. My dad, mom, sister, and her kids and I are all registered as status Indians by the federal government and are members of the Wee-Waa-Kaw community at Cape Mug. My identity and reality were and are as Indigenous person. In addition to my sister Corey, I have 2 half-brothers, William, Jumbo as we call him, and Corey. We didn't know of Corey until recent years. My extended family is large and sprawling, a web of endless aunts, aunties, uncles, and cousins. Many live on Indian reserves or around Vancouver Island, while others live close by in places such as Campbell River, Comox, and Courtenay. All have headed to the bigger cities of Victoria or Vancouver. Some also live south in Washington state. Many of my older relatives attended residential schools. My dad managed to be protected from them. More on that later. And the possibility of attending a residential school was never a threat to Corey and me. I did not grow up on reserve, though I have had a house on my reserve in Cape Mug since 2006 and have spent as much time as I can living there. In my early childhood it was somewhat nomadic. Mom, Corey, and I had lived in Vancouver, Calgary, Victoria, and Port Hardy all by the time I was 10. After that, we settled in Comox, where I lived for the next 8 years and graduated from high school, Highland Senior Secondary School, in 1989. While evidently I may have been an ugly kid, I was headstrong and determined, without fear from my first days. My mom describes this as my having personality. I guess these traits explain why I had more than 200 stitches by the age of 12. This pattern has continued in adulthood, such as when I impaled my right arm on a wrought iron fence when I was in my 20s and had to be hospitalized. I come by it honestly. My mom, a teacher, is pretty fierce and determined herself. When I was in grade 3, she was my teacher, and one day during the first week of school, my work apparently was not acceptable. When Mom asked me to correct it, I stomped off. Mom, in front of all the other kids, marched me down to the principal's office. Definitely a win for her, as the other kids were now scared. If she could punish me in this way, what might she do to them? Yeah, guys, let's start having a little bit more of that in the schools, right, guys? When I was a teenager, I tried all of the stereotypical teen stunts. One time I snuck out at night only to find Mom in my bed waiting for me when I returned in the wee hours of the morning. Mom likes to say I was full of it. She calls me a rat for all the mischief I got into in those years, though she gives me credit for being a good student, a good athlete, going to the BC Summer Games twice for swimming and track and field, and more importantly, for always being very caring towards elders. Tim McKinnon, one of my favorite teachers from those days, described me as an unusual kid who sat back and watched a lot, was something in revealing her full self, and also acted out a fair bit, though he is kind in saying my acting out was bright and full. He says I always thought about things before I spoke. I like to think that is still true. Growing up, we would see Dad regularly, but it was a reality that he was traveling much of the time for his work as an Indigenous political leader. When I was younger, my dad would send me a plant on my birthday every year and flowers to Corey on hers. I think he felt the need to send us something living, something that needed care, almost as a reminder of his deep love and care for us and his pride in how we were growing up. There were some periods of time when we would see him more. Corey and I lived with him and his second wife Shirley and our younger brother Jumbo in Comox for my grade 5 year, which was the longest stretch we were with him. During that year, he was traveling as usual, which was really hard, but it did mean we spent a lot of time with his mother, my grandmother, Ethel Puggledy. We called her Granny, and she also lived in Comox, about 25-minute walk from my dad's house. Corey and I would walk there often. Our Granny was a force. She has been a profound figure in my life, in some ways a shaper of the person I am as much or more than anyone else. I know it is hard to understand what I mean when I say this, but in many ways, the story I tell in this book, entering into Indigenous politics, moving into Canadian politics, becoming a minister of the Crown, and then speaking truth to power and being kicked out of the Liberal caucus because of it, is particularly her story. I think by the end of the book it will be clear what I mean when I say this. I hope so anyway. Oh, I got goosebumps. That was me, not Jody. But don't mistake me. Many things my granny experienced feel worlds apart from the reality of my life, and she, like so many others, endured things I can barely imagine. We do not know exactly when my grandmother was born, but we guess it was around 1910. The only records of her birth were destroyed because of fires over the years. She was the oldest of 7 kids. At age 9, she was sent to residential school with her younger sister. Just checking to make sure that I'm still going here, guys. Okay, don't want it to be wasting my breath, you know? Wow, this is getting good. Not good, not good. You know what I mean? She was oldest of 7 kids. At the age of 9, she was sent to residential school with her younger sister Alice, who was 8. At the time in our territory, it was typical for Indian agents to just show up in a boat and take the kids away. Her father wanted to avoid that, so he brought his children to Alert Bay himself, where he brought them some clothes and dropped them off at St. Michael's Indian Residential School. They were going to be forced to go one way or another. In 1990, my grandma was recorded by Corey telling stories of many aspects of her life, including her first day in residential school. Of course, many generations of Indigenous people from across the country have stories of their experience in these schools, many of which were heard by Canadians through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. My granny passed away before the commissioner did its work, and I'm grateful to have her recollections recorded in this way. Okay, so this is going to be Granny's, I guess, story, because it's in italics, and I think it's probably going to be sad, so brace yourself, guys. I will never forget the day we went there. There was a little Japanese lady in Alert Bay that made clothes, and I don't know whether my parents had seen her, but anyway, we didn't go to school until towards evening, when the little dresses she sewed for us were made. And mine was pink and my sister's was blue, and they were the nicest things we had ever had up to then. Funny what you remember. We went to school, and we must have went there in the evening because it was time to go to bed. You had to be there August 1st, and that is still summer up there. That is when the good weather starts. We would go to bed at 7 o'clock, and we would hear the kids playing and all the noise outside. And I thought it was so cruel, but I guess they were doing their best for the little dumb, ignorant Indian people. Didn't know anything. It was a great big dormitory. I forget whether there were 52 beds in this room, this dorm. It's hard to read with the italics, sorry guys. 40 or 50, and there were two big porches, glassed-in porches, where they would put the kids that they suspected of having TB. They were segregated at night, and they had to watch them for symptoms, whatever the symptoms were. But seems like whatever they did unconsciously, they always seemed to separate you, so they put me at one end of this great big dorm, and they put my sister in one corner and I in the other corner, and there was no electric lights. When they went out, the place seemed so dark. It was a great big dungeon, all those metal beds, row on row, like you were in jail. Not a jail. Jails are little cubicles, aren't they? Anyways, it looked like an institution. Well, it was. It was an institution, so I couldn't sleep. I had never gone to bed that early in my entire life because I was like a little gypsy at home, you know. We just did exactly what we wanted to do, playing. It was a great life. So I could hear my sister sobbing. You could still see, because the summer nights don't seem to get very dark. I said, come on. They put me in a double. Why, I don't know. I think they did everything to torture me. I was on a double. Little bunk beds, only they were metal ones, army cots. I was on top one, and instead of putting my sister down below me, they put in a regular little bed. She said, I can't get up to your bed. You better come into mine. I crawled in bed with her, and we cried ourselves to sleep the first night. Quite a few nights after that. When I listen to my granny say those words now, I hear some of the sorrow and pain in her voice, but what comes through far more is the indomitable fortitude of this woman, the unrelenting strength. She had that strength as a child in terms of being at residential school, and said, something told me that you were put here to learn how to talk English so you can talk for your people. Another story she tells about the school was when they were threatening to send her to reform school in Vancouver unless she ratted on what some of the other kids were up to. My granny had never been to Vancouver, so she told them to go ahead and send her. Instead, they decided to strap her, which my grandmother said was almost a daily occurrence. On recounting that occasion, she said, they said the first time we cried, they would stop, but I was too stubborn. I didn't care if they beat me till I was dead. I just bit my teeth together so I wouldn't cry. They just gave up strapping me, but I could feel the blood running down my legs. That is what we learnt from the Christians. My grandmother was eventually kicked out of the residential school, a blessing. Her first marriage, she had 3, was an arranged marriage at the age of 14, primarily for the purpose of bearing children to join families. Wow, that was me. As she would often say, the first marriage was for duty, the first marriage was for duty, the second was for children and comfort, and the third was for love. My dad was the second. But when I think of my granny, I'm pretty sure when anyone thinks of my granny, I think none of these darker and sometimes horrific things. Rather, I think of her indomitable spirit and certainly her role in our culture. As a keeper of knowledge, her place in the potlatch, her leadership, it is often how she brought our teachings into my life, demonstrated them in her life, and how she guided us. Granny lived in an old greenhouse at the end of Centennial Avenue in Comox, with a little alcove off the front door with 4 chairs around a table. For countless hours we just sat there listening as she talked, shared, and schooled us. Just as I cannot imagine my life without her guiding me along the way, I cannot reflect on the truth of my story without discovering and sharing more of hers. In my speeches and interviews, I often talk about addressing Canada's legacy of colonialism. My grandma lived that. My granny lived that legacy, like so many have and still do, of being an Indian in Canada. She also revealed so much of what we need to know to address the legacy and live fully as Indigenous person in Canada. Somehow my Canadian journey as an Indigenous woman led me to Cabinet, and in some ways that experience deepened my experience of being an Indian. That is the story that I try to tell. Long before I entered federal politics, I was involved in Indigenous leadership. On November 27th, 2012, I was re-elected by Chiefs of BC as the Assembly of First Nations, AFN, Regional Chief of British Columbia. In Canada, the Indians are politically divided up into approximately 600 bands under the Indian Act. A small number of these bands have transitioned to self-government. Currently, there are 25 organized self-governing nations in Canada, representing 43 Indigenous communities. They collectively belong to a political organization called the Assembly of First Nations. There are 10 regional chiefs representing regions of Canada, as well as a national chief. At the time, I was the only female regional chief in Canada, as I had been since first being elected in 2009. I was also chair of the First Nations Finance Authority, a board member of the First Nation Land Advisory Board, and a counselor for Wee-Waa-Ka, my community. Wee-Waa-Ka is like a lot of communities. It is small and part of a larger Indigenous language group and nation that was divided up by the Indian Act. We, along with other communities that are part of a broader nation, have long tried to negotiate a proper relationship with the federal and provincial governments. Like most such efforts across the country, this has never gotten far. No, nothing has. That was me. When re-elected as regional chief, it never crossed my mind that I would not finish my second 3-year term. It would have been unfathomable that the reason I ultimately did not was because I would end up running to be a member of Parliament for the Liberal Party of Canada, and that I would become a minister. In fact, the Minister of Justice and Attorney General in a country that had colonized Indigenous peoples for 150 years. Ludicrous. My only political preoccupations in 2009 as a newly elected regional chief were about the increasingly complicated and sometimes dysfunctional reality of national Indigenous politics. When Sean Altleo, who is from the community of Ashot off Vancouver Island and was regional chief of BC before me, arrived on the scene as national chief of the Assembly of First Nations earlier that same year, he was confronted with many ongoing realities. These included the lack of respect for Indigenous rights by governments, of course, but also a lack of appreciation on the part of a number of long-time regional chiefs from across the country of his BC roots and his skills and focus on building bridges with all the Canadians. Sean had been elected in the AFN national election by a razor-thin margin against Perry Belgrade, who is from Little Black Bear in Saskatchewan. There have always been a challenging relationship between the Indigenous leaders from British Columbia and those from parts of the rest of the country. I suspect other regions would say the same thing. One of the main reasons for this divide is treaties. Historic treaties are in place over most of Canada. The numbered treaties entered into between 1871 and 1921, but not in British Columbia. These treaties were understood by Indigenous peoples as a proper recognition of their title rights and government as documents that secured particular lands to them as part of the treaty settlement. Canada has viewed these treaties as land surrender agreements and even then has utterly failed to honor them. Other than part of the Treaty 8 in the northeast of BC and the pre-Confederation treaties on parts of Vancouver Island, there were no historic treaties entered into British Columbia. This is a significant issue. While all First Nation people have experienced colonialism in the same way in terms of the imposition of the Indian Act in residential schools and being governed over by a separate Department of Indian Affairs, some of the areas of political and legal focus have been distinct, and sometimes that result in different priorities. In those early AFN executive meetings, attention was often intense and little concrete work was getting done. Sean and I were natural allies in terms of policy objectives and strategies, as well as trying to change the way the AFN operated. We were both interested in migrating some of the long-time tensions that existed between and among regions. However, the executive was basically split down the middle on regional and general lines. There was also the challenge that not everyone on the AFN executive was as prepared or ready to work as hard as others. This was not a dissimilar from federal cabinet, as I would learn later. Some regional chiefs would not come prepared for the meetings. This drove me crazy as there was so much work to do and so little time. It was here where I became more aware of the fact that in some cases people may get into politics primarily to achieve office. They do not necessarily aspire to use that office to do something for the better, the world and lives of people. It still upsets me that I have met some who have perceived to be passive seat warmers, both in national Indigenous politics and federal politics, who listen to others and let them do the work without contributing much of what needs to be done. Kind of reminds me of the Governor General right now, Mary Simons. Thank you, Jody, for that. Okay, back to the book, guys. Dialogue at the AFN executive often followed typical patterns rehashing the same themes and lines of getting off topic. Decisions were often foreordained and not always debated in principal terms. Sean worked in ways that I supported and often led to overcome this pattern, but change was slow, as is often the case in organized cultures. And then there were the fact that I was a woman in a boys' club. This was also not dissimilar from the culture of Parliament Hill. There had never been a female national chief and only a handful of female regional chiefs. Sexist remarks were regular. In one heated meeting of Indigenous health, an older regional chief said, "Don't worry, little lady, I will protect you," and patted me on the knee. "Gah, I can't protect myself," I replied loudly. So I'm just going to make a comment here. This is Jody Raybould talking about shady Indigenous leaders, right? Because there's always cactuses in everybody, right, guys? And if you watch me on YouTube and Facebook, you'll understand I have a cactus, which is what an object I use to describe people I don't like. Okay, back to the book. Sorry, getting off topic. Go and check my time. Anybody need a pee break? Better go now. Okay, getting back to the book. Where did I leave off here? Okay, here. In such circumstances, I know that to keep quiet is enabling. Even where it is difficult to speak up, one must, not with aggression or malice, but with conviction and strength, and with kindness that says, the world is changing and people need to change as well. I know that people need to understand that they may be a part of the problem they are trying to fix. I do not know if this individual at the meeting really ever understood what he was doing, but he never said anything to me quite like that again at the executive, and I hope he thought twice before speaking in such ways in other contexts. During my time as a political leader in the Indigenous communities, I gained a reputation for speaking my mind. I remember one of the first meetings I had with the Union of British Columbia Indigenous Chiefs, UBCIC, an organization that historically has represented the perspectives of those First Nations in the province that do not support the BC treaty-making process. When I challenged the orthodox on sovereignty and rights recognition, if the sovereignty some leaders supported was followed into its logical conclusion, it would mean splitting up Canada. I rejected the idea of sovereignty as meaning the end of Canada, but I do support sovereignty in the sense of structuring proper nation-to-nation relations between Crown governments and Indigenous governments that recognize Indigenous nationhood, title, rights, jurisdictions, and laws. I do not think any leader had ever spoken about this issue in the way I did during the first meeting. I think I may have challenged people, but I also supported rights recognition and rebuilding our nation as part of a strong Canada. Back during the constitutional negotiations in the 70s and 80s, the goal for my father and other leaders was a construction. I don't know. I think I've been reading too long, guys. That included recognition of the history, place, nationhood, government, laws, rights, territories of the Indigenous people in Canada. I have always said that bringing Indigenous peoples into Confederation, finishing this unfinished business so that Indigenous people can see their faces in the mirror of our Constitution. That was the word, Constitution. I thought there was an R in it. Oh man, I'm going to take a sip, guys. How's everyone doing? I almost spilled my coffee. Okay. Unfinished business so that the Indigenous people can see their faces in the mirror of our constitutions is the best approach for ultimately improving the quality of life for Indigenous people and in Canada as a whole. I still believe this. On top of the internal challenges at the AFN, we were dealing at best with the indifferent Stephen Harper Conservative government in Ottawa that was not sympathetic to true reconciliation. A hostile government is probably a more accurate description, and particularly as a result of this, the dynamics in the Indigenous world were changing. Relentless among Indigenous peoples was spilling over into the streets and onto the headlines. For the first time in a long time, Indigenous matters were a preoccupation of the country as a whole. Indeed, I think 2012 and 2013 will be looked upon as a time when permanent shift about Indigenous realities in this country took place in Canada, in Canadian consciousness. This is virtually important as it is only with increasing awareness of truth of our history and present circumstances that real change can take place. Ideal No More, of course, was in the forefront along with hunger strikes. For a time, this movement galvanized work at the national level. Idle No More started in late 2012, established by a number of women who were protesting the dismantling of environmental protection law and calling for a real nation-to-nation relationship with the Crown, a relationship based on respect. Protest movements under the Idle No More banner sprouted up very rapidly across Canada and beyond. This led to several hunger strikes, including one by Chief Teresa Spence from Ottawasask. The push for tangible change was growing fast on every issue you can imagine, from upholding Indigenous rights to dealing with the housing crisis on reserves. I believe Idle No More was a cry for us all to do better. In the wake of the protest, Sean, along with few Indigenous representatives from across the country, including myself, met with Prime Minister Harper in January 2013. As we sat in the meeting, the sound of drums could be heard outside the Langevin block, renamed the Office of the Prime Minister and Privy Council in 2017. While not making too many commitments, Prime Minister Harper did at least agree that he needed to establish a high-level mechanism to oversee reform on the way Canada negotiates modern treaties and how it implements historic ones. Senior oversight committees were formed that included representatives from the Prime Minister's office, Privy Council Office, Indian and Northern Affairs Canada, INAC, as the department was called at the time, and the AFN. The Prime Minister also agreed we needed to get rid of the Indian Act and said he wanted solutions. We, of course, told him we had solutions. But ultimately, the challenges of renewing the relationships between First Nations and the Crown overtook the AFN when Sean was accused somewhat unfairly by some chiefs of cutting a backroom deal on education reform with Harper government. It was clear the end was coming for him. Sean began to recede until he ultimately resigned in May 2014. And for me, all this turmoil meant I was extremely busy, which I have always been. Driving my hard work was my continuing passion to see change happen and to build on the work of the leaders before me, now fueled by the renewed and increasing energy of Indigenous youth and women from across the country. But my frustration was also growing. Work in BC was fine. We had completed most of the major initiatives we had set out to do, including progress on the First Nations rebuilding strong and appropriate governance, which had been my primary focus. And as was often the case at the time, it seemed easier for BC leaders to make progress compared to much of the rest of the country. In BC, we were able to move work forward at a provincial level through the combination of our three province-wide organizations: the First Nations Summit, the British Columbia Assembly of First Nations, and the UBCIC, collectively known as the First Nations Leadership Council. This progress was evidenced by the formation of a province-wide health council, an authority, and an education steering committee, as well as the support given to nations leading the charge to advance rights recognition in the courts. Ultimately, like Indigenous people across the country, I was getting restless. While I appreciate the true change takes time and some progress was being made, the pace of change was too slow and inconsistent. We had to do more. Change takes courage, including the courage to break away from old ways of doing things that are not achieving the needed results. The groundwork had been laid. We had experience and we knew what was working and what was not improving the lives of our people. But the change was not deep enough or as widespread as it could have been. And while I was working harder than I ever had, my anxiety to get more done was also increasing. Deep inside, I knew to help drive that necessary change, I was going to end up adjusting my political direction, but I did not have any idea what that might look like. A reoccurring theme in my life is that almost out of nowhere, I come to realize my path has shifted. This is especially true in relation to the leadership roles I have been guided towards and fortunate enough to play. Fate seems to intervene. Without my instigation, person after person and event after event send me on my way towards a realization of where I need to focus my energy. Given this theme in my life, I am not surprised that going to Whitehorse to attend the 34th Annual General Assembly of the AFN in July 2013 ended up marking the beginning of my life in federal politics. It was there I first met Justin Trudeau. Oh, you poor girl. Okay, that was me. But as I think back and try to remember what was going through my mind in that lead up to the moment, how I felt, what I wanted, and what, if anything, I anticipated, little is clear. The one obvious and relatively constant force in my non-Indigenous political life was former Prime Minister Paul Martin. We first met in person in 2012 when he slipped into the back of the room at the BCAFN AGM I was hosting at the Weston Wall Centre in Richmond. He appeared when we were presenting financial statements, so from the stage we cracked the inevitable jokes about having a former federal minister of finance evaluate the statements. Prior to that, we had to talk on the phone a few times. Our first ever conversations took place when I was on the ferry between Prince Rupert and Digby Island to Cheyenne territory. I was impressed that the former Prime Minister would be calling me as I visited Indigenous communities on the Northwest Coast. At the time, I had no real idea what was motivating him to contact me regularly. I suspected, and he later confirmed, it was because of the interest in the Indigenous governance work we were doing. Ever since his time as Prime Minister, when he had tried to drive a transformational breakthrough in the Crown-Indigenous relationship through the Kelowna Accord. Indigenous governance had been one of his passions. He recognized that addressing Canada's legacy of colonism required Indigenous governments to rebuild, and he wanted to be a part of that, including through the Indigenous education work he was spearheading at his foundation. But beyond Prime Minister Martin becoming a friend and a mentor, there had been little fostering of a connection to the Liberal Party or a potential role in federal politics. We never discussed that he was also sizing me up for the Liberal Party. I realize now that he must have called Justin Trudeau, Gary Butts, and or Carolyn Bennett, who was the Liberal aberrational affairs critic at the time, saying I was someone they should meet or talk to. This became more obvious in the lead up to the White House AGA. Trudeau's office reached out to mine and asked to set up a meeting in Whitehorse. We were told Trudeau, then the leader of the third party, would be hanging about to watch some of the assembly, meet the chiefs, and learn more about the relationship with the Indigenous people. I found out later that a primary reason he came up to Whitehorse was to also meet and try to recruit me to run for the Liberal Party. The first time I saw Justin Trudeau was when he walked into the back of the assembly room while I was up on stage. He listened to my report on the Senior Oversight Committee and the tensions with Harper government, and also sat in on a workshop I was facilitating on some of the government's policies, including those that guide the government in how they negotiate treaties, often referred to as the Comprehensive Claims Policy and self-government. He mostly just listened. Later in the afternoon, I headed to a small room in the Coast Hotel next door for a private meeting that had been arranged for Justin and me. By that point, I knew I would not be surprised if the issue of me running for the Liberal Party came up. But going into the meeting, I truly did not know if that was something I would consider if asked. I had questions, concerns. I wanted to see what this son of a former Prime Minister was like. Well, side note, this is just me, but Trudeau's daddy was around when residential schools were going on in the 90s, right, guys? Okay, back to the book. I also wanted to see what this son of a former Prime Minister was like. I had to read that again. Was he down to earth? Was he kind? Was he interesting? Did he share any of the same versions and values as me? Was he authentic, or was he just another typical politician in the mold that has historically, at best, put many Canadians off politics, and at worst remove their trust in politicians and governments? Oh, okay then. Yes, he did. He sure did. Okay, guys, I gotta take a sip. Okay, take a pee break. I did not know the answers to these questions or what to expect. I was aware he was a bit of a celebrity. I was a little nervous, not about meeting him or being starstruck, more about being sized up and the growing feeling that was building inside me that I was being courted. It felt a little overwhelming. Why me? Why now? And just why? Yes, we needed a transformation in federal politics, but Indigenous leaders almost never cross over into that world. Why would I be the one to do it? Should I be? Justin opened by saying he was happy to be in Whitehorse and to listen in on the assembly. He did not want to waste any time. He was organized and I guess you could say charming. He talked about his vision for politics and the next election. He said he wanted me to run for the Liberal Party. It was not a job interview, it was a job offer. Sorry guys, I was checking my time, make sure it was going. I did not answer him. I steered the conversation to my questions around a vision for the country and values. and I conveyed my frustration, my restlessness at the lack of coherent and tangible change regarding the place of Indigenous peoples and beyond. I gave him examples. I told him of our meeting with Prime Minister Harper, the work of the Senior Oversight Committee, and the importance of rights recognition and self-government. I liked him. Yes, he was a smooth talker, but at that time it did not come across as an act. We even talked about our fathers, how they had gone toe to toe years before, and how we were now talking. He seemed genuine, and I believed him to be so. As the meeting started drawing to a close, I told him I would think about running. I was committed to my role as regional chief, and the work we were doing, but I also knew in my gut that work would not be supported further with the Harper government in power, and given the existing legislation and policy respecting Indigenous peoples, we will keep in touch, Justin said, and Jerry will be calling. And so it would be that on that day in Whitehorse, my relationship began with both Justin Trudeau and Jerry Butts, the two most powerful people in Canada for all the years I was minister in government. I think, like many people, I often know I'm going to end up doing something, even as I'm telling myself and others that I have not yet made up my mind. The voice in the back of my head is already spoken and is preparing for our coming to terms with the change ahead. This was the case coming out of the meeting with Justin Trudeau. As much as I have tried to deny it, I had pretty much made up my mind. I was going to do it. I already knew that getting something serious done for Indigenous peoples was going to require stepping up in new ways. With the ongoing challenges at the AFN, that organization was going to struggle to lead that change. In some respects, this remains true today. As Tim and I talked about it as we left Whitehorse, we could feel ourselves getting excited, and we became increasingly so over the weeks and months that followed. I had first met Tim when I was at the British Columbia Treaty Commission, BCTC. Tim was chief negotiator for the West Bank First Nation, negotiated the West Bank Self-Government Agreement, and had been deeply involved in decades in development of legislation creating First Nations fiscal institutions and land management regimes. I had been immediately taken with Tim. Not only was he one of the smartest people I had ever met, he was deeply passionate, thoughtful, caring, and funny, and remains so. A wonderful partner in work and in life, we got married on November 29, 2008 in Cape Mudge. His counsel was invaluable as I moved towards this life-changing decision. The full court press from the Liberals was on. Paul Martin and Jerry were in touch a fair bit, encouraging me. I started talking to a broader group about the possibility of running. There were many Indigenous voices who would have preferred I run for national chief. Sean was one of those. We met in Gastown in Vancouver. He was still national chief at the time. He pressed hard that by being the first woman national chief, I could breathe new life into the work and the organization, help with the needed institutional reform, and to re-envision it, to make it less Indian Act focused. I thought hard afterwards about his words. I valued them. They also echoed in some ways the voice of my grandmother that I could hear in my head. Nasty white politics, I could imagine her saying. Some of my Indigenous friends and colleagues' observations reinforced in me a nagging fear about whether I should run or not. Would people think of me and treat me as a token or a box ticker candidate? As a woman, as an Indigenous person, and most certainly as an Indigenous woman. At some level, I knew this would be true, but I felt this was just the cost of politics when people like me had been excluded for so long. There would be many costs, I imagine, so it would be. And at the same time, I was buoyed by the fact that there was a difference between mainstream Canadian politics and Indigenous politics around tokenism. Despite the bad behavior of certain leaders in Indigenous politics, that was no place for tokens. I knew my chiefs and the vast majority of Indigenous peoples would never think or treat me this way. In many Indigenous cultures in Canada, through our families, communities, and clan systems, people are raised to be leaders from birth. In my nation, the values, roles, and responsibilities of leaders and names and ceremonies that reinforce those are integrated in the rhythms and realities of life. For these reasons, position, rank, and commitment matter. Hard work matters. Fulfilling one's role and responsibilities matters. There is no space or time for place for tokens. And of course, we all Indigenous leaders feel such an urgency for change. There is little time for unseriousness or focusing on appearances. If I asked and chose to run for national chief or go to federal politics, it would be expected that I would lever every possibility to make a real and tangible impact and to bring my values to the political space, to push in ways that had not been pushed before. My developing relationship with the Liberal Party did not become public until the Liberal Biennial Convention held in Montreal in February 2014. Tim and I traveled down to Montreal from Ottawa, where I had been for meetings as regional chief. I had in fact spent most of the day meeting with Harper government officials and political staffers who were not aware I was going to be co-chairing the convention that week or that I was thinking about running. I knew everyone would figure it out soon enough, and whether or not I said it publicly I was running, the rumor mill would assume I was. Tim and I did not have any idea what to expect when we headed to Montreal, as neither of us had attended anything like a political convention before. Although we both had been involved in politics for years, we were still political something when it came to this sort of partisan politics in Canada. It was not our world. In the Palais de Congrès de Montreal, there was palpable excitement in the air. We could feel it. At times I wonder if I was just naive, but I know that was not fully the case. I understood that in Ottawa at the time, the political world was on the edge of its seat with the idea of change in the air. There was a new hope, a new generation. Trudeau optimized this, and he was surprisingly credible. The Harper government had become embroiled in scandal, and everyone knew it was likely on its last legs. The convention excluded this sense of anticipation and change in the extreme. The delegate after delegate came up to me on the convention floor at the hotel and at the airport to express their excitement about the future of the country. They made me feel hopeful. They made me want to run and to confirm that the voice in my head back in Whitehorse had already told me. Like any convention, as I now know, this was not all excitement and unity. One could see from the tensions that would continue to play themselves out in the years ahead. There were, of course, many dedicated, hopeful delegates representing their electoral districts and working to build the best country. I so love and admire these people. They are there because they want to see the full potential of Canada met. They are not there because they are seeking political favor or power for its own sake. Yes, they may be partisan, but being a liberal or having membership in a political party does not define them. What does and what binds us all is being Canadian. These people continue to inspire me every day, regardless of political affiliation. Okay, that's pretty deep there, guys. That was me. But there was also a political class that made me uncomfortable, some of whom seemed as preoccupied with self-interest and opportunities as they were pursuing a big, bold vision of real change. I bet you somewhere in here Christia Friesland's coming, guys. That's just my speculation. Okay. Oh, and Stephen Gubo. Right, guys? Can't wait. Okay, back to it. And while I was certainly feeling caught up in the energy of the convention, there were also little indications of the changes to come. For example, as a co-chair, I was given speaking points by the party leadership. These included their desire to have me use the term middle class. I had concerns about how this term was being used, as they were not being clear about what they meant by it. I now understood that there was a standard political practice of appealing to an undefined and middle class to reinforce a certain perception. While I recognize this has been shown to be successful, in my mind it remains wrong and unhelpful. A teaching instilled in me from my upbringing is that words matter because you cannot take them back. I try not to use terms or speak in slogans. Oh, did I skip a page? Speak slogans when their meanings are not clear, especially when those words are being conveyed publicly. This remained the case throughout my years as minister. Yet aside from what I viewed at the time as little things, I was fully swept up in the excitement and optimism, and with the discussions around the issues being raised. I was a little surprised by this, and so was Tim. I had never really been interested in mainstream Canadian politics. Beyond voting, I was not involved much. Even given my political roles, I did not follow closely House of Commons debates or the political chattering class in the media. I studied politics in our institutions in university and on my work life, legislation that was important to our agenda. Unlike many in that sphere, I, for one, would never sit down to watch Question Period. Guys, you need to start doing that. That's me, okay? So Jody's saying she didn't really take much interest, and I didn't really either, okay? But I watched the old Question Periods now, guys, okay? Back at her. However, I often went to parliamentary committee as regional chief and knew a lot of people as a result. But I was not a political insider. I had never belonged to a little political party and did not really understand the world inside the Ottawa bubble and the realities of the politics of Parliament and how it truly operates. This was a practical knowledge I lacked, for better or worse, depending on your perspective. It would be a problem for the future, as I had high expectations for people and for the institutions they were responsible to uphold. It was never a game to me, as it turns out it is for many. Of course, I was and still am a politician, but an Indigenous politician, and that is not the same thing. Indigenous politics have real differences from mainstream Canadian politics, animated by the distinct worldviews and experiences of Indigenous people. Our worldviews are integrative. We organize our lives and realities in recognition of the interdependence of all things in existence, including all things in nature. For these reasons, community and kinship are essential, and a community is as strong as its constituent parts. Individuals have required responsibilities and roles in making the community better. This is why, for example, when someone passes away, the whole community stops, feels the loss, and uplifts each other. This is also why Indigenous politics can look and feel so different. Every Indigenous leader typically speaks of the lineage they come from and represent. That is because they view their role as a community role, not an individual one, and the work they do as measured in generations, not electoral cycles. Right? Right. That was me. What we do is for the past, the present, and the future, not just to get re-elected for 4 years. This was the political culture I was raised in. The main leaders in my family were my Auntie Donna, my father, and grandmother. I always took up my Auntie Donna Tyndall, nee Cook. She was always out protesting and speaking up and raised my cousins to be activists. She has passed away, but she left a mark on the world by many things she did. As an example, Auntie Donna encouraged and supported my granny adopting in our traditional way in potlatch. Leonard Peltier, who was imprisoned since 1977 for murders of 2 FBI agents in 1975 at the Pine Ridge reservations in the United States. For those of you who are not familiar with this story, check out Incident at Ogla in 1992 documentary by Michael Abdid, narrated by Robert Redford. Whoa, guys! Might have to mark that down. My auntie had connections to the American Indian movement, and she, along with so many others, campaigned for Peltier. I'm just going to check and make sure we're still recording. Okay, good to go. Okay. Where was I? He had come up from the United States to Comox a number of times, including when I was a child, and became close with our family. I often think of the portrait Leonard painted by my grandmother in her regalia, with an image of Auntie Donna behind her in front of a totem, which is said to represent my father. It shows Donna's back, not her face, because she had passed on. My father was and is the optimum of a leader. He will be until his last breath. He was raised to be and chosen to be our chief. I cannot really remember my dad not being in some form of leadership role. He was always the center of attention and focus. Over the years, we had very interesting relationship. We had our ups and downs, yet I have always been proud to be his daughter and have always marveled at watching and listening to him speak. He taught me what it means to be authentic, to speak truth, no matter the consequence. His leadership style was uncompromising. He never brought into the mode of hang around the Fort Indians. He had always been about storming the fort. He had a fortitude that I have not witnessed in many people. When I was young, I worshipped my father. Now, having been in my leadership role myself, I have gained the deepest respect for him and all that he accomplished and sought to accomplish in the face of so many challenges. While he is not a traditional father, he did not tuck me in at night or come to my swim meets. He always made sure I knew that he was thinking of me, and he raised me to lead. My grandmother always had people calling on her. She was the keeper of knowledge of our Musqueamog Taswinac traditions, sorry about that, culture and language, and as such central to our potlatch and our connection to the old people. Every year she would catch fish, and we all had to help. Corey and I spent a lot of the time with my granny, traveling to potlatches or sitting around her as she drank tea and held court at the kitchen table unless another world was on TV. My dad depended on his mom, and he was her prized child. Many of my grandmother's other children have sadly died over the years, along with other close family. My grandmother knew suffering more than I have ever known, and she channeled that into being a true leader while also teaching me what it meant to be Muskamag, to be proud of who I am and where I come from, to know my rights and responsibilities, and ultimately what it means to be Indigenous woman leader. I just want to say, I think that's really important. We need to know our rights, guys, but also our responsibilities, okay? Rights and responsibilities, right? Right. Okay, back to the book. This understanding of leadership and how it is embedded in our culture and community is also why Indigenous modes of decision making are so different. For many Indigenous people, decision making is communitarian and consensus based, though there are many differences and distinctions between peoples and nations in how decision making operates. We are always working to build that consensus from which a decision will emerge. Individuals do not decide, nor do they have the authority to decide. The spark of truth comes from everyone contributing, sharing, building the best decision together. Yeah, not censoring us, right, guys? Oh, I couldn't resist. Sorry. Okay. I'm like that person at the movie theater. I gotta shut my mouth. Okay. Back to Jody. Almost every Indigenous environment that I have been in, whether it was gatherings of hundreds of chiefs around small band council table in community halls or at executive of the AFN, at the end of the day, striving for consensus was the paramount ethic. At the 2014 Liberal Biennial Convention, I heard speaker after speaker talk about doing politics differently, in quotations. That's what she said, which I equated to helping mainstream Canadian political culture become more consensus-based, less partisan, and less about individual power. I thought, as I said in my remarks to the convention, that there was much that could be learned from Indigenous legal orders and governance practices. My hope that the future really would look different, and that this Liberal Party was ready to be a part of that difference, was reflected in the speech I gave. I had worked on it in the weeks prior, and it laid out what I thought had to be the path on Indigenous issues. The message was simple, that the work of addressing our legacy of colonialism and recognizing and implementing Indigenous rights and practicing better governance would make Canada better. So this is Jody's speech, I guess. The resurgence of Aboriginal governance based on Indigenous legal traditions will, over the next generation, change for the better the way Canada is governed, not only in transforming Indigenous nations, but our country as a whole. For I believe that truly having a third order of government in Canada with real power and real influence would be good for federation and for creating the proper national balance. I agree. Oh, shut up back there. Okay, back to it. As Aboriginal peoples continue to take back control of our lives, so too will all Canadians take back control, ensuring we have a Canada that I think we all aspire to live in, a country based on shared values and principles that we have spent years as a nation fostering, creating, a caring and liberal society to ensure our place as a forward nation and one of the best countries in the world in which to live. I laid out the plan, a plan that Indigenous people had built over years of tireless work of establishing a principled, comprehensive rights recognition framework in new legislation and policy. What is needed is the political will, I said. It also requires, I continued, a nonpartisan approach to developing federal Aboriginal policy. In this area, as in some key others, ensuring a long-term federal strategy that lives beyond the life of a single government, that has multiple party support in its development and implementation is prudent. In my own but absolutely clear way, I was laying out my vision of a different politics, more independent, less partisan, and committed to working through greater consensus. The Prime Minister-to-be and the party insiders knew I was, if they ever thought I would be anything other than committed to this vision, then they were not listening or thought I was just being political. I guess the years ahead revealed the truth. Reflecting on the pressures that had been building for years, I underscored that action was needed now. I cannot stress enough the need to proceed with urgency. Canada cannot, as a country, afford to let another generation of Aboriginal peoples down, because in doing so, we are letting Canada down. Our people are simply crying out for change and are taking steps to secure that change, and we need partners. The speech echoed themes and solution I had spoken about for years as regional chief, and was the same message I delivered as a minister in the years ahead. And as always, I reinforced that the core values that needed to guide our approach are the best of Canadian values. And she goes on to say this: wherever we live, this was her speech, wherever we live or whoever we are, no matter how we are governed, as Canada, we all expect that our governments will be respectful of the principles and values upon which our country was founded, as we continue to develop the very idea, the very concept of Canada as a beacon of hope and optimism in a world increasingly shrouded in conflict and division. For me, core Canadian values include, among others, kindness and generosity, a strong work ethic, trust, respect, and integrity. Wow. Wowee. I think I'm going to take that quote and you're going to see it uploaded on Facebook. Okay, guys? Okay, back at it. I was very nervous when giving this speech, which was not unusual for me. I have always been nervous when speaking publicly. To this day, I still do not really enjoy it. Justin was in the front row beaming. Oh yeah, of course he was. And he talked about this real change, right? Yeah, he's just a used car salesman. He talked about real change and he took it all. He took all our change. Oh, okay, sorry guys, sorry. Okay, Justin was in the front row just a beaming. Okay. Tim was also in the front row wearing a classically conservative blue sweater and a tag on it that said Observer. He was sitting next to Margaret Trudeau, Justin's mother. I'll keep my comments to myself. I think Tim was being a little contrarian with his choice of attire. After I finished my speech, Justin ran up on stage and, as he does, gave me a kiss on the cheek and a hug, and I just felt relieved. The speech seemed to resonate at least as much as I could tell as such a staged event. Most important to me was the response to the message, a bold action on Indigenous issues, unlike what we had seen before in Canada's history. Everyone was saying the right things, especially the future Prime Minister. Yes! Carolyn Bennett was one of my barometers of the party's stance on Indigenous issues. I really liked Carolyn and considered her my friend. I feel like she just stepped down around Christmas time. Sorry, that was just my own notes. If you guys have been subscribing and watching, Okay, back to it. We had already been working together for some years after appearing a number of times as regional chief before the House of Commons Standing Committee on Aboriginal Peoples and Northern Development. I started to chat more with Carolyn about issues and began to meet up with her when I was in Ottawa. She had also began sharing with me her preparatory work for a committee, including the questions that were developed by the committee's staff, which I found interesting and helpful. I actually thought committees were important at this time and an important part of the legislative process. I still feel they should be, but they simply are not right now. I will say more on that later, as there is much that needs to change with the way the House of Commons and its committees operate. I think I know what you're putting down there, Jody, because like Jody said, she didn't really follow the House of Commons, nor did I. You watch House of Commons and they do this committee stuff on the side, okay, guys? I don't know. Okay, sorry, guys. I just like to put my side notes in when I can, okay? Because I've been paying attention, okay? Carolyn had taken on the cabinet of calling me a national treasure. I thought this a little strange, but I know she was trying to be endearing. Before the convention, she had been actively encouraging me to run, and at the convention, and certainly after the speech and in the follow-up, she pushed even harder. I had a clear sense from her and everyone else who was in a position of influence that they agreed with the vision and plan for Indigenous policy I had laid out. At least they said they agreed with it. Brackets, and let me say again, it was not my plan. It was one that Indigenous leaders had endorsed and had been informed by numerous commissions, reports, and studies. End bracket. I felt there was an alignment and vision and shared a sense of purpose. I was optimistic that there was a team that was ready to do the heavy lifting and real work together. I left Montreal feeling more excited than when I had arrived. It was time. Back in Vancouver, I felt captivated by the convention, by the people I met, by Justin, by such a large... Just checking the time, guys. By such a large number of people who seemed to have the same vision and desire for change as I did. It was all a bit intoxicating, and I was swept up in it all. Some close to me were a little more skeptical. Tim had never liked Justin very much, and while he fully supported me running, he was not excited or sold about the seriousness of our future Prime Minister. Some of my staff at BCAFN were also not keen on the likelihood of real change being afoot. Of course, the Indigenous peoples, the proof would always be in the pudding. Change had to be seen to believed. I thought I had seen it coming. I thought there was a path, and I was all in. Over the months after the convention, I began to plan out how to move forward. I had to consider many things, including where I might run. There was a lot of wrangling with the Liberal Party brass in BC trying to convince me to run in a number of ridings that had no connection to, such as Esquimalt, Wanda, Fuka. It seemed like people were just being moved around a map with no rhyme or reason. It started to feel a little chaotic. In April, I went to meet Justin, where he was in Vancouver. He was finishing his yoga when I walked into his hotel suite. I'm all in, I said to him, putting aside my feeling of awkwardness at the informity of the meeting, and I want to run in the new, sorry, I'm just kind of, picturing Justin in yoga. Sorry, guys. Sorry, let me regroup myself, okay? It's almost feeling a little, Weinstein stuff. If you knew me, and have been watching, I want to grab my poop emoji, guys. Okay, sorry, back on track, guys, back on track. Okay, so Jody walked into him Justin finishing up yoga, okay, into his hotel suite. Okay, and I want to run in the new riding of Vancouver-Granville. It had been where I wanted to run ever since I begun contemplating the decision. I was born in what is now affectionately and simply called Van Gran, a Vancouver General Hospital to be precise, and was moving back to the riding. It was winnable, but not a lock. At the time, Tim and I were living in Raven Woods on the Tsleil-Waututh Nation lands in North Vancouver. While it is more common than you think for people in large urban centers to run in a riding they do not actually live in, I thought it was essential I live where I ran. I expected that I would have to compete for the nomination for Van Gran, but when I told Justin that morning in the Sheraton Wall Center that I wanted to run in Van Gran, he responded, "Then that is where you will run." And so it began. Okay, that's chapter 1. I'd like to hear what you guys thought of that. So we'll either discuss it here on the podcast or on my other channels, where you can find me on Facebook and YouTube, okay? I'm new to this, okay? All right. My takeaways from chapter 1, and I'm just going to do it like you'd see me on YouTube and Facebook. My chicken scratch notes, and I'm going to scratch away. Okay, so my takeaways. Well, it seems like, back before Trudeau, tensions were running high because Indigenous weren't being recognized, and we got treaties and stuff going on. British Columbia in the book said they didn't. Now, I'm a little bit confused with treaties, I have to say. So, I've listened to this a few times with editing and stuff, and I'm going to listen to it one more time once it's uploaded. Just want to make sure it went in order and whatnot. But when tensions were running high there, it seems to me that Trudeau kind of used that to his leverage. Jody talked about tokenism. And, during that time, they were talking about splitting up Canada. Jody rejected that. I believe that was through one of the Indigenous groups. Jody supported the rights recognition, rebuilding nations for a stronger Canada. Okay, I'm going to start scratching here. Okay, so why would Trudeau recruit Jody? How did her working for him help, I think it was to help promote his brand. Anyways, that's just me. Jody discussed in the book about having 3 levels of government, which is kind of what they were talking about, whether it was Harper or Trudeau, okay? There's so much going on, and I'm doing this podcast and whatnot. I like that idea, because right now we have a Liberal NDP coalition that aren't doing us any good, okay? So, they're like a bromance going on. So if we had a 3rd level of government where Indigenous voices were heard, I think that would be very beneficial, okay? And then that's it, that's all, okay? Because I'm sorry, people can't come to Canada anymore and, go on about their oppression, because right now every Canadian is being oppressed. The ones who have been here generation after generation, okay? We getting oppressed now, okay? Canada, was in a lot better shape before Trudeau was in. And that's my opinion. And everybody I've talked to, it's the same. So, you know what? Hop on, hop off, okay? Jody gave up running for the national chief for Justin Trudeau. And I think Jody seems to have regret that, because she could have probably did more just working with, you know, First Nations groups. And I don't know if I'm saying all that right, because again, you know, I don't know a whole lot about treaties and all that, but I got the meat and taters of it, okay? And Jody talked about Indigenous cultures, clan systems, raised to be leaders from birth. Okay, guys, can we go back to that? Can we start raising leaders? That would be awesome. I think there's a lot we could learn from our Indigenous friends, okay? Jody talked about, you know, there was somebody from an Indigenous group that, you know, seemed to be kind of putting the moves on her. And, you know, it goes to show, and she had talked about how she was going to meetings to do the work, and Indigenous leaders were running late, not taking it serious for whatever reason. And, you know, Jody just kind of reconfirmed what happens in every culture, every race, every gender. There's always good and bad in everybody, okay? That's me shaking my cactus. And I don't know anything about Jerry Butts, to be honest with you, so we're going to have to look into him a little bit more, or we'll learn more as the book goes on. But, you know, Jody said she thought there was going to be real change, and that was Justin Trudeau's slogan, you know, real change, but he took it all, right? And Jody said that when she first met Trudeau, and I think that goes for what everyone thought when he came out with his fancy socks and all that stuff, was that he was charming, and everyone believed he was to be genuine, right, guys? Because I kind of fell for that, but after about 2 months, he sickened me. So it's been a long 9 years. Okay, and then to end her off, I think what was in the creepy department, on a whole bunch of levels, that's not good for a Prime Minister that has had a grocery list of scandals. When Jody went into his hotel room, was it Vancouver, to let her know that she was going to run with the Liberal Party, he was there in his yoga gear, and Jody felt awkward, was her word, awkward with the informality of the meeting. Okay, those are my notes, guys. Tell me what you think, okay? Stay you, stay true, get to talking, and this time, get to reading, okay, guys? Chapter 2 is coming up. I think it's called Running.